Today I speak with Professor Shibley Telhami, the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland, a Wilson Center alum, and also director of the University of Maryland's Critical Issues Poll. With that role, Professor Telhami had zoomed into the pulse of the people and society across the MENA region on many critical issues, from the Palestinian-Israeli conflict to US foreign policy in the region, as well as domestic, economic, and political challenges that the region faces. Professor Telhami, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Today is day 13 since the Hamas attacks on Israel that killed more than 1,400 Israelis, and the war on Gaza that has killed more than 4,000 Palestinians and displaced over 1 million in the Gaza Strip. The risks for escalation beyond Gaza remain very high as this conflict intensifies every day, especially with what we've seen in the last 4 to 8 hours with the Ma'madani hospital bombing and the outrage and protests it has triggered across the Arab and Muslim world. What is your current assessment, knowing, of course, that things are changing very rapidly on the ground?
Well, the first thing, for those of us who've been watching this issue over the decades and have actually witnessed some wars in between on large scale, this one stands out. It stands out in terms of the brutality, in terms of the scale of civilian suffering in such an intense period of time of less than 2 weeks. The first you've mentioned on the Israeli side, obviously the 1,400 dead from the Hamas attack, but also thousands of wounded altogether, probably close to 5,000 people dead and wounded. And on the Palestinian side, we've had so far over 15,000 casualties between dead and wounded, and obviously the hundreds of thousands of homeless and misery and catastrophe and health services and absence of water and food and fuel. So it's been a cruel 2 weeks. It is one that's heartbreaking, and it doesn't matter, whether you're looking at a Jewish victim or Arab victim, an Israeli victim, Palestinian victim. It's just heartbreaking. These are mostly innocent civilians who get trapped and get killed in this way. So that scale is really, really stunning. And that's why you find a lot of people who watch this issue who can't even talk about it anymore. It is so, and so that thing is important because it's not only a human disaster that we can't deal with immediately and we're not able to deal with immediately, but because it hardens the hearts. And so what you have, every time you have a war, this is not unusual, obviously, when you have so many loved ones who were killed brutally in a way that you can't understand, and you watch it and you're helpless, and then you focus on your own suffering, you focus on old loved ones, only on your loved ones, you're incapable of empathizing with the suffering of the other. And there is an urge for vengeance that goes into overdrive. And so that's why I think that when those of us who study conflict and understand those kind of tendencies, that's why you need sober leadership. It's not likely to come from inside because leadership gets trapped into the dynamics of their own people. And particularly if they had failed in their politics and they have to show that they're doing something about it, it has to come from the outside. And I think that's why I have, just to see why the United States need to be mindful. There is nothing that justifies targeting or recklessly killing civilians. Those are war crimes. Doesn't matter whether Israelis carry them out or Palestinians carrying them out or what group carries them out, unjustified, and they are ones that we have to be mindful of. So therefore, there is a responsibility, first of all, the international community to intervene to limit the civilian toll in a big way, and that's priority number one. Priority number two is typically in those kind of conflicts. In the past, we've seen more limited fighting between Gaza and Israel, still brutal, and a lot of civilians, usually very disproportionately on the Palestinian side because of the asymmetry of power. But you could see that there were rounds of, quote, establishing deterrence or new rules of the game, and they go back to business as usual, and there's a ceasefire. And you could figure out, at least what there's going to be an interim ending, and you go from there. And in this particular case, that's not on the horizon for now, in part because of the scale of it that has hardened people's hearts and says this is not acceptable. So there's, on Israel, the aim has become, quote, destroying Hamas, whatever it takes. Some people have been calling leveling of Gaza completely. On the Palestinian side, obviously it depends who you're talking to, because Hamas is the one that's carrying out the battle. Principally, they're not obviously Palestinian Authority is not involved. So because of this dynamic of no end in sight and the possibility of a ground offensive by Israel, that's even likely, not just possible, where there'll be more casualties and more devastation, more destruction, without a particular end that's clear. Then it's unclear what destroy Hamas means. It's unclear what you do even if you destroy Hamas afterwards. So there's no one reason why everybody's depressed, including Israelis and Palestinians, is that it seemed as though there's no path at the moment. Nobody is giving kind of a path forward. The third thing to say is that obviously this round was started by a horrific attack by Hamas, really committed war crimes in what it did in Israel, and so many innocent civilians who died ruthlessly, and obviously that generated quite a bit of reaction. But the conflict itself didn't start with Hamas. It won't end with Hamas. Hamas is obviously something that is the focus of attention right now. There is a context, not for people don't, a lot of people don't support Hamas either among Palestinians or in the Arab and Muslim world. But there was regardless of what Hamas was doing, regardless of Gaza, there was a sense of despair that was widespread across the Palestinian territories and in much of the region over the Palestinian territories. Now, when I say despair, that includes the West Bank, where Hamas does not control, where the Palestinian Authority controls. I was in Israel and the West Bank just a few days before the war started. And that amount of despair is because of a number of things that are all connected. One is 56 years of occupation with no end in sight. And people talk about two-state solution. Every day it's becoming less and less likely in the West Bank. And now you have a rise of a very far-right Israeli government that says the West Bank belongs to us. Right. Settler violence is increasing. So all of that created an environment of despair. And while that may not be a direct cause, by the way, explanation and justification are not the same. When you explain something, you're not justifying something. Nonetheless, it provided an opportunity for Hamas to exploit that sentiment.
And you mentioned, of course, the West Bank. It has received little attention, beyond a few headlines we've seen across, U.S. newspapers in particular. What is your reading of the situation in the West Bank? And what can the Palestinian Authority, if anything, what can it do to maintain relative stability? And relative is key.
Put aside for a moment the Palestinian Authority. Obviously, as I described, there's despair that preceded even the attack by Hamas, and then the Israeli bombings, subsequent Israeli bombings in Gaza. There was Palestinians felt utterly vulnerable because you have rising settler violence against them, and even backed by some ministers in the Israeli government. And no one really to defend them. And the Palestinian Authority was being accused by Palestinians of being essentially a subcontractor for Israeli security without being able to defend the Palestinians. And honestly, it couldn't defend the Palestinians, including against settler violence. Settlements were being built in a very fast way. In towns like Bethlehem, Beit Jala, Beit Sahur, you could see the settlements coming to the hills around them, lands that were owned by people from those towns. And so there was total despair. I mean, total despair. And of course, that a lot of us who have been studying this have said there's likely to be an explosion, especially when there's no hope, there's no political process. Arab governments are making peace with Israel without insisting on ending the occupation. We obviously, most of us focus on the possibility of an intifada, a popular intifada, but this is also usually a good opportunity for militant groups to exploit the sentiment to their advantage. And the Palestinian Authority is weakened as a consequence, because obviously they were not able to do anything, weakening vis-a-vis the Palestinians. But oddly enough, they strengthened internationally because the international community does not want to deal with Hamas. So it needs to have an address in the Palestinian areas. So it goes to talk to the Palestinian Authority.
And so you mentioned, the exploitation of Hamas and, of course, other, militant or violent extremist factions in the, Palestinian-Israeli arena. So one of the issues that has also come up is the timing of this and whether this was linked to the Biden administration's, diplomatic sprint between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And we've heard also both leaders from both sides on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly meetings, Benjamin Netanyahu on one end saying that we are close, and then Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, telling Fox News that every day we get closer. What is the impact, first of all, on the Abraham Accords, and any prospects for Saudi-Israel normalization?
Yeah, so let me say two things about that. The first is we don't really know enough about the timing of the Hamas attack, yes, because some of it had to be tactical and this may have been prepared long before even any optimistic talk about Saudi-Israeli relations. And the shocking reality isn't that Hamas would do this. We know they're capable of attacking civilians in the past. The shocking thing is that they had the capability to do it, and the Israelis did not detect it, and that is leading to a lot of questions about capabilities, where these came from, how that happened. That's been put aside for now. At some point, we might learn that maybe the timing was more tactical, more technical, more this or that. So we need to be very careful in our quick analysis. But despite that, to the extent that there was a political environment, there's no question that the Saudi-Israeli potential deal played at least into the despair that they've exploited, in large part because the Palestinians, given the asymmetry of power, have very few political levers to influence Israel. So they were hoping the Biden administration would do something after Trump. Obviously, that didn't happen. They were hoping Arab states, especially Saudi Arabia, which is the powerful state that still does not have peace with Israel, would use that ultimately, as it had said for decades, that it will make full peace with Israel only after Israel ends its occupation. And obviously, it looked like that was not going to happen, meaning there was going to have a possibility of peace, certainly without ending the occupation or making major progress toward ending it. That led to a lot of resignation and despair. And yes, that clearly plays into the militants' hands, undoubtedly.
And what of the Abraham Accords that have just last month marked the 3rd anniversary?
Well, first of all, Arab states have their own strategic interests, and those obviously don't always coincide with the Palestinians. We've seen that. They're dating back to the Egyptian-Israeli treaty, and the Jordanian-Israeli peace, the Abraham Accords. Everybody's doing it depending on states and governments' interest in, advancing what they want, rather than obviously prioritizing the Palestinian issue. That has not changed for the states that signed the Abraham Accords on the Arab side, or to Saudi Arabia that might still want peace. What has changed is that they've always in the past have assumed that our public opinion cared about the Palestinian issue. In recent years, that had diminished because the Palestinian issue was not at the forefront. Now, this is the forefront story, and you could see the sweeping sympathy with the Palestinians across Arab and Muslim countries in a way that propelled this into the forefront and applied the brakes on Arab states that want to make peace or have made peace with Israel. So I don't think, will it jeopardize these Abraham Accords that have been signed? It could, depending on what happens, obviously, in the coming days and weeks. But for now, I think every government is just going to wait to see how this is going to play out without making any major decisions.
Professor Shibley Telhami, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise.
My pleasure. Thanks for hosting me.